Hey everyone. The first topic that we want to cover today is the Nernst equation. It's an equation that looks a bit complicated for us to need to know as physicians, but in actuality, it's a really simple and elegant way of understanding one of the most important aspects of human physiology, which is the flow of ions across the cell membrane. But before we can understand the equation, we have to first discuss a little bit about cells and their environment. As you already know, each cell has several different channels that allow specific ions to enter and exit the cell. For example, we have channels that mainly allow the movement of chloride ions, such as our CFTR channels, which we'll be discussing in our cystic fibrosis lecture. And we also have channels specific to other ions like sodium and potassium. So again, there are channels that are specific to ions, and we can think maybe for chloride, we have our CFTR channels, and for sodium, we're going to be talking about our ENaC channels later. Cells also exist in environments with differing ion concentrations. So you could theoretically have a lot of sodium on the outside of your cell compared to the inside. And if we were to open up one of these specific channels to just sodium, like ENaC, all the sodium would want to go into the cell. But if we had a channel specific to potassium ions, and we had a buildup of potassium intracellularly, the potassium would want to flow out of the cell. So what we want to know is what happens to ion concentrations when we open up these specific channels. To get an idea of how ions would want to flow in and out of a cell, let's take a look at the movement of ions as a neuron is activated. So if we think back to what we know about action potentials, we know that initially it starts at some sort of resting potential, maybe around negative 65 millivolts. Then you get a slight depolarization up to, say, negative 55 millivolts. Then at this point, for some reason, you get this massive spike. And it goes all the way up to maybe, say, positive 70 millivolts. Then, for some reason, it goes all the way back down and gets repolarized to about negative 80 millivolts. Then we get back to our negative 65 millivolt resting potential. So why does this all happen? Why do we start off at negative 65 millivolts? Why do we hit this negative 55 and then burst up to 70? Why do we stop at 70 and then go to negative 80? Why do we go from negative 80 to negative 65? Well, all of that is described by the Nernst equation. And all of that has to do with ions moving down their electrochemical gradient as an ion-specific channel is opened. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a look. So if we take a look at a neuron, and we break it up, now on the top, we're going to pretend these are sodium specific ion channels. So they only allow the movement of sodium. Down here, these channels only allow the movement of potassium. So they are potassium-specific ion channels. We also know that the resting potential of a neuron is negative 65 millivolts. And let's see, what else do we know? We know that extracellularly, our sodium concentration is 140 milliequivalents per liter. And intracellularly, it's 14 milliequivalents per liter. For potassium, it's sort of the opposite. Potassium on the outside, it's going to be about 4 milliequivalents per liter. And on the inside, it's going to be about 120 milliequivalents per liter. Okay, so now what do we do with this information? Well, we know that when a neuron is activated, all of these sodium-specific ion channels are going to get opened. So if all of these are opened, and pretend these are closed, then we have about 10 sodium ions for every 1 sodium ion over here. We can also think of this negative 65 millivolts as sort of existing right here. So this negative 65 millivolt charge really wants some positive charge to balance it out. There's only 1 sodium ion over here, but there's 10 over here. So of course, these sodium ions are just going to want to flood in, which they will. And they'll keep on doing that until they get to about a positive 75 millivolt charge on the inside. So recall that negative 65 millivolts is with respect to the extracellular environment. So every time you have a sodium ion that moves from the extracellular environment to the intracellular environment, you're going to keep on moving up along this curve. And over here, you get to a point where you've built up enough positive charge on the intracellular side of the plasma membrane that no more sodium ions want to come in. This is your equilibrium point, where the rate of sodium coming in equals rate going out, which makes sense. So now, how do we explain the repolarization? So, when we get to the positive 70 millivolts, luckily, these guys all shut off. So now we're going to just cross these guys out. So what does that leave us with? Well, we no longer have negative 65 millivolts as our charge across the membrane, so we're going to cross that out. But what we do have is we have positive 70. We also know that we have a bunch of positive charge on the inside of the membrane with this 120 milliequivalents per liter of potassium ion concentration. And extracellularly, we have a really, really low potassium ion concentration. And if we open these potassium-specific ion channels, what's going to happen? We're just going to get a flood of potassium ions going out. And that's going to happen until eventually the inside becomes negative enough, maybe around negative 80 millivolts, such that some of the ions want to come back in. And so this is now this equilibrium point, where the rate of potassium going out equals rate going in. So that makes sense. So this process of opening and closing of ion-specific channels happens every single time an action potential is transmitted down a neuron. First, sodium channels open and sodium flows into the cell, and then those channels close and potassium channels open, allowing potassium to flow out. This entire process of ion movement, as I said, is described by the Nernst equation. So let's take a quick look now at how it does that. So the Nernst equation tells us how we know which direction ions will flow when specific channels are opened, and at what point the ions will stop wanting to flow in that direction. It says that ions will move either into or out of a cell based on two separate but related driving forces. So it's important to note that they're separate, but they are related as well. So the concentration and voltage differences are going to be those driving forces. When these two forces are considered at the same time, the resulting force is called an electrochemical gradient. So separately, the concentration is just a chemical force. And the voltage, of course, is an electrical one. Hence, we get an electrochemical gradient. The voltage necessary to stop the movement of ions down their concentration gradient is called the equilibrium potential, and that is calculated through the Nernst equation. One small side note to mention is that in reality, ions can flow in both directions through a channel, but at the equilibrium potential, the rate of ions entering equals the rate of ions exiting the cell. This means that there will still be ions flowing through the channel, but that the intra and extracellular concentrations will be unaffected. So if we think about our initial example, we started out with a resting potential of negative 70 millivolts. Then we opened sodium channels. Well, I guess we started around negative 65 millivolts, and then we opened sodium channels such that the rate of sodium entering the cell was greater than the rate of sodium exiting. So if I were to draw this out again, this was what? Plus 70, maybe plus 75. This was negative 65. And eventually, this continued until enough sodium entered the cell to give the cell a positive charge of, like I said, plus 70 or plus 75, at which point the rate of sodium entering and exiting the cell were equal, and this was our new equilibrium potential. But practically speaking, why do we care about this equilibrium potential? We already knew that when you activate a neuron, you open sodium channels, and the sodium moves in. And then after that, we knew that the potassium moves out after we open the potassium channels. I mean, we knew that in pre-med. Isn't it good enough for me to just remember that, I guess? And so the answer is, well, not really. Because now consider a situation we've never seen before. We wouldn't know what to do. I mean, sure, it'd be easy if the cell was negative on the inside and we were looking at a positively charged ion that had greater extracellular concentration. It would automatically go in. But what would happen if we were looking at a negatively charged cell and an anion that also had greater extracellular concentration? So let's get a little bit more specific about that. So we're going to take the example of the CFTR channel. So if we look at the opening of a chloride channel like CFTR in lung epithelial cells, we might not know which direction the ions would flow because the extracellular chloride concentrations would be greater than the intracellular ones. So if we go back to our understanding of chloride concentrations now, they sort of mimic how sodium is going to be present in the body. So we know that extracellularly, sodium has a high concentration. We know that NaCl is typically how we find sodium. So if we have like, 140 milliequivalents per liter extracellularly for sodium, chloride's probably going to be about 105 milliequivalents per liter. I apologize. My cat's trying to also give his input. Alright, and now on the inside, we still have roughly that tenfold difference, so it's going to be about 10 milliequivalents per liter for our chloride concentration. And here is our CFTR channel. And we are assuming a resting potential of maybe -65. Well, I guess if it's smooth muscle, it'll probably be about -60 millivolts. And so now the question is, we have a lot of negative charge on the outside. We have negative charge on the inside. So if we just look at the charge, we would think that this 10 milliequivalent per liter of chloride would want to go out the CFTR channel. But then if we look at the concentration effect, we have 105 milliequivalents per liter on the outside and 10 milliequivalents per liter on the inside. So we'd think that the chloride would want to move in. So how do we know which way the actual chloride ions are going to flow? Well, we have to figure out which factor had a greater effect on creating the electrochemical gradient, whether it was the concentration difference or whether it was the charge buildup. So that's what the Nernst equation does. It can compare the concentration versus the charge effects. So the equation says that the equilibrium potential, E, equals 2.3 times the quantity R, which is our universal gas constant, times T over Z, which is the valence, times the Faraday constant. All of that multiplied by the log of the extracellular ion concentration over the intracellular ion concentration. So this is pretty cumbersome of an equation to try to hold on to, and I find it easier to just think of normal physiologic conditions ending up as equaling E equals 60 over Z, which is your valence, which is pretty easy to find out. So for, say, sodium, it would just be 1. For chloride, it would be -1. For calcium, +2. So your equation, say like for sodium, would just end up being 60 times the log of the ion concentration outside the cell over the ion concentration inside the cell. So now that we can calculate our equilibriums, let's take a quick look at how we would apply this to the human body. So let's first take a quick look at what an electrochemical gradient might look like for a cell. So depending on the function and location of a cell, its resting potential will most likely vary between -60 and -100 millivolts. Skeletal muscles typically have resting potentials of around -95 millivolts. Smooth muscle would have maybe resting potentials around -60 millivolts, and neurons are around -65 millivolts. Cells also have different concentrations of specific ions compared to the surrounding interstitium, which, as you know, is the non-plasma component of extracellular fluid. So let's quickly remind ourselves of what that means. So here we have our blood vessel with our endothelial cells and our plasma. Over here, this is the interstitium with our interstitial fluid. And of course, here's our cell. And this is all the extracellular compartment. And this, of course, is our intracellular compartment. So, for example, if we look at sodium inside the cell, we'd find a concentration of 14 milliequivalents per liter, like we said before. And then outside the cell, we'd find it at 140. So in the interstitium, this would be your concentration. And then over here, this is your intracellular concentration. So these differences in solute concentration across the cell membrane are created and maintained by active transport mechanisms, and that's really important to know. In particular, the most important one to remember is the sodium-potassium pump. So when you think of electrochemical gradients, think created and maintained. So we'll say electrochemical gradient created and maintained by sodium potassium pump. And remember, since this is active transport, this is an ATP pump. And this is important to remember. Okay, now let's look at a specific example of what would happen if we opened a potassium channel given the electrochemical gradient of a smooth muscle. So in this case, we have an extracellular concentration of 4 milliequivalents per liter and an intracellular concentration of 100 milliequivalents per liter with a resting potential of negative 60 millivolts because now we're dealing with smooth muscle. So whenever we see a question like this, we automatically start by looking at the concentration effects first. So let's draw this out. So if we have our cell and we have our potassium channel, and we have inside the cell a concentration of 100 milliequivalents per liter, and on the outside we have 4 milliequivalents per liter. Automatically, we would think that the potassium would want to exit the cell and go from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. Now imagine a point charge added inside the cell that would exactly counter the desire of the potassium to move down its concentration gradient and out of the cell. Our question is, what would the charge of that ion have to be? So, intuitively, we would be confused, since potassium would have a desire to remain in the negatively charged cell, because remember, this is negative 60 millivolts. But I mean, it also wants to move to an area of lower concentration outside the cell. So this is where we pull out our trusty Nernst equation. Alright, so let's quickly remind ourselves that the Nernst potential gives us the voltage necessary to balance the desire of the ion to move either into or out of the cell. So that's why I have this right here. It's the voltage for the balancing charge inside the cell. So in the previous example, potassium, because of its concentration gradient, would want to move out of the cell, but we want to figure out what type of negative charge we can place inside the cell such that the potassium doesn't want to move out anymore. So if we were to calculate what that charge is, we use our Nernst potential. We say E equals 60 over Z, where Z is the valence, of course, and that is plus 1. And we multiply that by the log of the ion concentration outside the cell, which is 4 milliequivalents per liter. And the ion concentration inside is 100 milliequivalents per liter. And that gives us a Nernst potential of negative 83.9 millivolts. Alright, so let's quickly go over our thought process. So first, we considered what would happen if the gradient was purely chemical, i.e. due to concentration and not charge. And then secondly, we considered what would happen if there was an electrical component as well. So if we took our cell, and we knew that based on concentration, potassium would want to go out. Our next question is, what kind of charge would we have to place right here so that the potassium wouldn't want to move out anymore? Firstly, we know that it's going to be negative, but we don't know the magnitude, and that's what we use the Nernst potential for. Now we can interpret our result and make a conclusion about the direction of ion flow. So, since we started with a resting potential of negative 60 millivolts, we know that we have to somehow make the inside of the cell more negative by only moving potassium ions, since that's the only channel we opened. So if we have our channel right here, and we have potassium at 100 milliequivalents over here, and we have it outside at 4 milliequivalents, we know that somehow we have to make this negative 60 negative 83.9 by only moving potassium. So the only way to do that is to move potassium out of the cell. And that's going to happen essentially until we reach that potential of negative 83.9, which is our equilibrium potential. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the potassium ions will move down their electrochemical gradient by moving against their electrical gradient. So if we look at the electrical gradient, potassium is positive. It wants to stay in the cell because the cell is negative. But the concentration gradient is so great that it pushes the cell to want to secrete potassium. This wouldn't have been able to be figured out unless we had the Nernst equation. It tells us that the concentration component in this specific example is the driving force. Alright, so now we have one more problem to think of. Cells actually have many channels, and they exist in cellular environments with varying ion concentrations. So, what do we do for cells in which multiple ion channels are open? So far, we've only looked at one ion channel being open at a specific point in time. But don't worry, this is actually pretty simple given that everything we know now. We know that cells have many channels, and they exist in a bunch of different environments, but we also know how to calculate the Nernst potential for each one of those channels based on what we just discussed. Now, we just need to know how many of each type of channel is open, and then we can find the combined Nernst potential for all the channels being open. So our key question now is, how many which type? So how do we do that? Well, we simply take a weighted average of all the equilibrium potentials. So again, a weighted average. Then we compare the resulting equilibrium potential to our resting potential, pretty similarly to what we had done before, and then we interpret our results. So let's take a quick example to make sure we have got this. Alright, so if we had a situation in a smooth muscle now, so let's draw our smooth muscle, which has negative 60 millivolts, and 90% of the channels are going to be potassium channels. And 10% are going to be sodium channels. Our question is, what's our new Nernst potential going to be, and what's it going to tell us? So how do we calculate it? It's actually pretty simple. So we just take E equals 90% times our calculated Nernst potential for the potassium-specific ion channel, which we just calculated to be, I think, negative 84-ish millivolts. And then we add that to, since we have 10% of the channels that are open are sodium, we're going to do 10% times the Nernst potential for a sodium-specific ion channel. So how do we calculate that? Super easy. We take 60 over the valence, which is 1, times the log of extracellular concentration, which is 140, over the intracellular, which is 14, and that is log of 10, which is 1, and 10% of 60 is 6. So that altogether is going to probably give us something around E equals negative 70, we'll say. So now that we've calculated our combined Nernst potential, what does that tell us? Okay. So it essentially tells us that for all the ion movement to stop, there needs to be a charge of negative 70 millivolts on the inside of this cell. So the question is, how do we get from negative 60 to negative 70 by only moving sodium and potassium ions? So potassium, like we said, 4 milliequivalents outside. Inside, let's say 100. Sodium outside, like we said, 140. Inside, 14. Alright, so let's first look at sodium. Sodium is going to want to go into the cell based on its concentration gradient. However, the problem with that is it's going to make the cell more depolarized, which means that the cell is going to become more positive. If you're adding more positives inside the cell, it'll become more positive. But we're trying to go from negative 60 millivolts to negative 70 millivolts. So that's not what we want at all. So now let's look at potassium. In the case of potassium, potassium wants to go down its concentration gradient out of the cell. And if it does that, it leaves more negative charge behind, which is exactly what we want. We want to go from negative 60 to negative 70. So that's going to be the main driver of ion movement in this situation. So even though we opened up a sodium channel, not much is going to go through. Our sodium concentrations are not going to change that much. But our potassium concentrations will change. So we still figured out which direction ions are going to move by using our Nernst equation. So that wraps up this lecture on the Nernst equation. You know pretty much everything that you're going to need to know.